Thanks very much, Paul. I actually thought that before launching into talking about the role that finance can play, it was useful for people who haven't heard a lot of the energy conversations this week to just frame the issues around how closely the low-carbon economy is tied to energy. So I wanted to just talk about three things in my opening remarks. Where we're headed under business as usual, where we need to go by 2030, and some context around how we're going to get there. And that, of course, relates to how finance can help facilitate that. So in terms of where we're headed on the current path, of course, as you might have heard this week, world energy demand will grow by about 40% by 2030. And 80% of that demand is going to be met by fossil fuels. So that's oil, gas, and coal. And most of the growth in energy-related carbon dioxide emissions is going to come from non-OECD countries. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind in this conversation, is that a lot of the low-carbon economy will have to be driven by what happens outside of places like Canada and the US and Europe, although we play an extremely important role. So that's where we're headed under current scenarios. And of course, under that scenario, some of the projections, depending on who you believe, as Paul alluded to, are that by the end of this century, we would see carbon dioxide concentrations in the order of 1,000 parts per million. We're in the low 400s now, I believe. And yeah.
Is 1,000 parts per million good or bad? Who thinks it's good? Who thinks it's good? Who thinks it's bad? No, get your hand up if you think it's bad. Okay, so we've got people who know something about climate change.
Perfect.
1,000 parts per million is bad. Back to you, Sandra.
Okay, yeah, I think it's bad too. I mean,
bad.
I don't think I'll be around to see it, but it is not a good thing, probably. So that's where we're headed. So where do we need to go? Of course, a lot of the experts are talking about holding CO2 concentrations steady at 450 ppm, et cetera. And I think the main thing about where we need to go is massive deployment of existing technologies in many cases, a lot of support for new technologies, and it has to be across all regions, across all parts of the world. And essentially, there needs to be a huge cut in emissions in OECD countries, and the countries that are trying to grow are going to have to, they're probably still going to have some growth in emissions, but that emission growth will have to be tempered.
Again, let's stop you there for a second. When you moderate these sessions, there's certain phrases that stick in your mind, and massive deployment is a lovely phrase. Would you agree? Massive deployment of existing technology. Massive deployment.
Okay.
We're talking about massive deployment of coal-fired power stations, natural gas facilities, the whole gig. That's what you mean, to give the world energy. Is that what you mean?
Well, I think that actually...
Nuclear? Bit of nuclear?
Well, you know, it depends on who you are, but yeah, what we believe, based on a lot of what the experts are saying, that not so much massive deployment of coal, although coal is not going to disappear. There's three basic things. One is energy efficiency, which again, lots of conversation about that, and really interesting from the financing perspective and public policy, et cetera. So efficiency in buildings and vehicles and industry, et cetera. Second thing is a shift in the way we supply power. So actually reducing coal-fired power, some fuel substitution, et cetera. Large increase probably in natural gas, and yes, nuclear, as well as a huge deployment in renewables, hopefully. And then the last, or the third piece is transportation. So there needs to be a shift, of course, in the way that we fuel our cars and the way we get around. So that's where we need to go, how we're going to get there. I think that the three things that we see that are needed, carbon price, incentives for technology, and behavioral change. And I think this is something that's downplayed by politicians, but individuals actually have an enormous role to play, and it's going to be interesting to see how we get individuals to be accountable for how their decisions are affecting whether or not we ever get to a low-carbon economy.